What is Raspberry Pi and what can you do with it? The Raspberry Pi is a very small computer the size of a credit card, but it is quite powerful and it can run a lot of applications. So what can you do with this board? And this is where the Raspberry Pi truly shines. Here are some examples of projects you can easily make with a Raspberry Pi. You can automate your home, make your personal devices smarter with IoT or Internet of Things. You can also build a retro gaming console, create a security or an alarm system, host a server for a web or mobile application. You can even run a Minecraft server on your Raspberry Pi. Program robots such as robotic arms, drones, hexapods, mobile robots, etc. Create a smart mirror. You can also install different operating systems, for example Raspberry Pi OS, Ubuntu, Windows IoT, and much more. Or simply use the Raspberry Pi as your own portable computer. And of course, this list is far from being exhaustive. You can find much more projects online, and you can also get inspired to create your own custom projects. One great thing about Raspberry Pi is the community. So, what does the community bring to you? Well, for example, you can see what other people do with their Raspberry Pi. You can ask questions, get some help for more advanced users. You can also collaborate with other users on similar projects and progress together. Raspberry Pi is created by the Raspberry Pi Foundation. The goal of the foundation is to make computers and digital making available for everyone across the world. For less than $40, you can get the Raspberry Pi board and the complete setup with computer, screen, keyboard, and mouse would cost you less than $100, which is a very good first step when you compare this price with the price of any other computer or laptop available on the market. The first Raspberry Pi board was released in 2012. Then, the foundation has continued to develop new iterations to make the board more powerful, add more functionalities, make it easier to use, and develop the community. In 2015, the Raspberry Pi 2 was released, with much more computation power than the first one. Then the Raspberry Pi 3 came in 2016 with again more computation power, and this time the Wi-Fi feature was directly integrated in the board, so you don't have to use a Wi-Fi USB dongle anymore. Today, the latest version is the Raspberry Pi 4, released in 2019. This new version is really great, much better performance than the version 3, a few changes in the external connectors to make it compatible with modern applications, and an increased amount of RAM. In fact, with Raspberry Pi 4, you can even choose the amount of RAM you want. The Raspberry Pi 2 and 3 had 1 GB of RAM, which was already good. Now, for the Raspberry Pi 4, you can choose between 2 GB, 4 GB, and even 8 GB of RAM, which is huge for that board. At the beginning, the Raspberry Pi 4 was also available with 1 GB of RAM, but not anymore. Now, what can you find on the board? Here you have the CPU, RAM, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chips, and all other components required to make the Raspberry Pi work. And let's focus on the connectors. You have one Ethernet port with Gigabit Ethernet, 4 USB ports, including 2 USB 3 ports in blue, one USB-C port to power on the board, 2 micro HDMI ports with 4K video support for 2 external displays, a jack audio output port, one display port for the Raspberry Pi touchscreen, one port for the Raspberry Pi camera module, a micro SD slot on the back of the board, and actually you will install the operating system directly on a micro SD card, and finally you have a 40 pins or GPIO header that we will use a lot during this course to control different hardware components with Python programming. GPIO means General Purpose Input Output. This header is the same for the Raspberry Pi 2B, 3B, and the Raspberry Pi 4. Alright, and now you should have a slightly better idea of what is the Raspberry Pi, its purpose, and the applications you can do with it.